Ready to study a bit? Solomon wrote 3 books in the scripture. You name them. Song of Solomon, obviously. Song of Solomon is this passionate, sort of poetic prose about marital love. Solomon wrote Song of Solomon when he was a younger man. And then he wrote the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs is written from the perspective of a father speaking to his son and giving him wisdom. Listen to my wisdom, son, in life. And then there is the book that we are studying through currently. We just started the book of Ecclesiastes. So, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon in the autumn of his life. He's grown reflective and a bit regretful over some of the foolish choices he has made throughout life. He's looking back upon that journey and again sharing his wisdom from his search for meaning and purpose and satisfaction in life. I said last week, there's almost this confessional air about the book of Ecclesiastes. It's the confession of a man who has learned the hard way about the empty promises of this world. Ecclesiastes, I said, could be viewed from the perspective of, it's really Solomon's journal, highlighting the life lessons he has learned. No other book like this in the New Testament, or the Old Testament. It's like a philosophical discourse. Solomon questions and he evaluates and he critiques everything around him, much like the postmodern man or a person in that midlife crisis. What's it all about? What's the point? He doesn't give quick answers, easy answers, but he will give answers. He's sharing life lessons. And that's why we've titled this series, Life Lessons from the book of Ecclesiastes. The opening premise in the book, this is still a bit of review, but the opening premise is everything is meaningless under the sun. 2 key phrases for the book of Ecclesiastes. Those 2 words, under the sun, that means from the perspective of life when you take God out of the picture. And what does life become? Meaningless, empty, it's futile, it's absurd, it's pointless. And all the negative comments in this book have that phrase as their frame of reference. Everything is meaningless under the sun. Okay? You take God out of the picture, what's the point? Solomon is writing to the secular skeptic, challenging them to consider the meaning of life. Consider the emptiness of life apart from God. And to illustrate from his own personal experience, he walks us down these number of dead-end streets in his own search for meaning and joy and satisfaction. That is what appeals to me about this book. Because in our society of everything is relative, and you have to be tolerant or otherwise you're accused of being judgmental. How do you take this non-believing skeptic and get him to consider the truths about Jesus Christ? If your starting point is, well, you have a sin issue and you need forgiveness and you need a Savior, I don't think that's going to be very well received. Again, not in our society where everything is relative and you have to be tolerant. But if you try to connect with that human longing for meaning and purpose, and what's this life all about? Especially as the skeptic confronts his own mortality and begins to question what is life about as they reach the end of their life. Maybe this is going to promote a dialogue. Everyone has a story. That's a line we came up Wednesday evening in our study. Everybody has a story. Sort of this search for meaning and purpose in our own lives. Each one of us writes our own book of Ecclesiastes. We try to make sense of life. And again, that is why this book is so relevant. Love this book. So, ready to continue? We're going to take a chapter a week for 12 weeks. It's 12 weeks, 12 chapters long. We come to chapter 2. Give me your email address if you want the notes. or email me questions, or please just show up on Wednesday evening. We had 16 people on Wednesday evening, which is really encouraging. And we just discuss the Sunday message. Here we go. Chapter 2. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good, and who could test pleasure better than a wealthy king. And so in his search for satisfaction and meaning in life, Solomon goes down the path of hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. He becomes a party animal, a good time Charlie. But here's what he discovered. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine. Not a verse really about the merits or disadvantages of alcohol. It's not, but it is sort of a questionable practice to cheer yourself by drinking a depressant, because alcohol is a depressant. Cheers. It can become just a drug to mask the unfulfilled longings of your soul. So I tried to cheer myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. And again, who could test pleasure better than a wealthy king? I want to give you a sense of that. Look at 1 Kings, chapter 4. Those history books like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles seem sort of boring to read through, but they give us so much data to make sense of the other books. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour. That's about 150 bushels. And 60 cores, 300 bushels of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, a grass-fed beef even before it was popular, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelle, roebucks, I don't know what that is, and choice fowl. That was his needs for one day. And every commentary I checked gave the same number. They said, that's going to feed about 15 to 20,000 people. In other words, Solomon has this huge entourage, very big people, a very big posse, all these people surrounding and sort of supporting his life that he cared for. And so Solomon experiments with intoxication and other indulgences of the good life of hedonism, absorbing himself in his search for significance and satisfaction under the sun, and his conclusion, it's all meaningless. It just left him feeling empty. Even laughter, he said, is madness. Now, Solomon isn't down on the value of entertainment, of enjoyment in life. In fact, it was Solomon who wrote in Proverbs 17, a cheerful heart is good medicine. A merry heart is good medicine. And I've always been intrigued with the scientific research about the therapeutic and the physical health benefits of laughter. In fact, I brought it with me. I'm reading this book on and off, but it's called The Laughing Cure. It talks about the value of laughter in our lives. Dr. Brian King, I went to one of his seminars. He's a psychologist, but he's also a professional comedian. One of the best seminars I've been to in a long time in terms of being entertaining. But at one point in this book, I'm going off on just a little bit of a sidebar here, the author talks about the results of a year-long online research project on jokes. It was conducted by a psychologist named Richard Wiseman. He hosted a website called Laugh Lab, where users rated the humor of jokes and then they submitted their own. The website received more than 40,000 joke submissions and 1.5 million ratings. It's the largest humor-related research project ever done. Dr. Wiseman was able to determine the world's funniest joke. Anybody want to hear the world's funniest joke? Okay, here we go. Two hunters are out in the woods when one of them collapses. He doesn't seem to be breathing and his eyes are glazed. The other guy takes out his phone and frantically calls emergency services. He gasps, "My friend is dead. What can I do?" The operator says, "Calm down. I can help. Let's make sure he's dead." There's silence. Then a gunshot is heard. Back on the phone, the guy says, "Okay, now what?" Supposedly, that's the world's funniest joke. And then the rest of the chapter sort of evaluates why that's funny. And so it is sort of it's a fascinating, enjoyable book to read. A cheerful, merry heart really is good medicine. There's a whole branch of therapy called laughter therapy. Laughter produces these brain chemicals that make us feel good. And so Solomon is saying the pursuit of pleasure, if that is what you live for, if that's the goal of your life, the truth is it's going to elude us and eventually you're going to be left feeling empty. Now in hindsight, as this old man, he's looking back, he's sharing his wisdom. After wasting years in the pursuit of pleasure, Solomon issues this warning: the pursuit of pleasure, it does not satisfy. The book of Ecclesiastes is so relevant. Our society is right here. So many people trying to cover up the pain of this empty life with the pursuit of pleasure. Peter Sellers, you know the name, Pink Panther. I know that was a number of years ago, but he wrote his autobiography that was entitled The Mask Behind the Mask. Never read it, but I love the title. The Mask Behind the Mask, written by this professional comedian. Laughter, partying, humor, underneath the sun, that is, without God in the picture. It's just foolishness. It's just the mask to hide the pain of our meaningless lives. Verse 4. Rush through these chapters because of the length. I enlarged my works. I built homes for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate the forest of a growing field. I switched from the NIV, which we're using in this study, to the New American Standard just on these verses because they highlight a key phrase that's repeated. Do you see what it is? 4 times. For myself. For myself. Solomon is not doing this for some altruistic motive of helping the community. He comes right out and he tells us, I did it for me. I was searching for personal gratification, something to fill that emptiness in my life. And so I began all of these building projects. I was very busy. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. It took him 13 years to build his own house. 7 years to build a temple, so he had quite a pad. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. And you can go to Israel today, southwest of Jerusalem. You'll find 3 very cavernous holes in the earth that were Solomon's reservoirs for watering his land, the pools of Solomon. Verse 7. I bought male and female slaves, and I had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. Solomon denied himself nothing. What we have here is the Playboy Mansion circa about 930 BC. Entertainment. Jimmy Buffett is singing Wasted Away again in Margaritaville. Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines in his harem. I switched those numbers last week and misspoke last week, but 700 wives. Do you remember Jim in Huckleberry Finn? That was one of the reasons that Jim couldn't believe the Bible, because the Bible said that Solomon was the wisest man in the world, and yet he had 700 wives. Jim couldn't see how those two things together, and you have to agree with Jim. 700 wives. That means 700 mother-in-laws. What was he thinking? He had wine, women, and song. And what happens at Solomon's? Stayed at Solomon's. And wealth, no thought of keeping up with the Joneses. His wealth surpassed everyone, and yet life, meaningless. Meaningless, an empty experience. He tells us how pointless, how profitless it was in verse 9 through 11. Jennifer's trying to understand my gestures. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labors. There was some pleasure in the moment. My heart took delight in all my labors, and this, the pleasure of the moment, was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed, when I took that reflective look back, all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Those two key phrases, under the sun. Life without God, without that perspective, that spiritual perspective, it was just empty, meaningless, pointless. So with no amount of sort of self-aggrandizing, Solomon's saying, man, I was the greatest. I was on top. I had it all. Whatever I saw, I grabbed. Immediate gratification. I refused my heart no pleasure. I denied myself nothing. And we need to just pause and think about that. Jeremiah tells us the heart's deceitful. It's desperately wicked. And we will hear this advice, just follow your heart. Not good advice. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Guard your heart. You need to purify your heart. Verse 12. Life is meaningless. And then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, while the fools walk in the darkness. Solomon's saying, I'm changing now from hedonism to wise living. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both, the wise and the fool. Verse 15, then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless, for the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. one of the takeaways from Wednesday evening was we're talking about chapter 1. It's just this question, and then what? Imagine you're talking to the secular humanist and you're trying to get him to think about the meaning, the significance of life, and he's following Solomon's life course in terms of the pursuit of pleasure or climbing the social ladder, and he's got it all. Well, and then what? And then what? To point out the senselessness, the pointlessness of that course of life. Well, and then what? Because eventually the last answer to the question, and then what, is, well, then I die. Maybe I'll be old, but I'm going to die. And then what? Doesn't this book just lift your spirits? So you keep in mind, Solomon is talking. He's trying to meet the unbelieving skeptic on their own grounds. And it's as if Solomon is saying, okay, let's assume God is out of the picture. But for the sake of discussion, if God is irrelevant, if God is non-existent, but without God, is there any meaning? Is there any satisfaction left to life? I've been on that search, and this is where it led me. Verse 17. So I hated life. I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun. Interesting statement as we reflect back to verse 10, because in verse 10 he was saying, you know what, my heart took delight in my labor. There was some joy in it. But when he pulled back and reflected upon it and asked the question, can this supply my life with meaning and fulfillment and satisfaction? His answer was an emphatic no. And then you die. I hated life because I must leave them, my accomplishments, to the one who comes after me and the one who knows whether that person will be, and who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. Yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. See, I got up early. I worked hard. There was some value and honor in that old-fashioned hard work. But Solomon's assessment of that, however, is under the sun. Well, I just hated it. Why is that? Because it doesn't provide satisfaction. He's saying there's only despair in all of that work that's done under the sun, in all of that work that's done apart from the spiritual perspective of life. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. What a contrast when you go into the New Testament and you read a couple of verses from Paul, because honestly, God designed us to work. Before sin entered the world, we're in the garden, and he gave us responsibility. There's honor in work and working with your hands. Solomon is coming from the perspective of under the sun. Paul, when he writes, he's talking about serving in light of the fact that we were created by God to honor him. So, 1 Corinthians 15, for example, Paul writes, always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. It's not meaningless. It's not pointless. It has eternal significance. In Colossians 3, whatever you do, Work at it with all your heart, as if you're working for the Lord. Okay? Whatever you do, and I love that verse because it qualifies the work of the Lord. Because whatever you do, when you do it with dignity and honor, you're doing it unto the Lord. Solomon actually agrees with that. He's saying that ultimately there's no satisfying labor in this life if it's done apart from God. But there's no distinction between secular work and spiritual work. That's the point I wanted to bring out of that. It bugs me when people talk about, oh, I wish I was in full-time ministry. Well, that's your choice. We all are. Whatever you do it unto the Lord. Work at it with all your heart, because you're working for the Lord. And when you have that mindset, then bringing a cup of cold water to someone is serving the Lord, as Jesus said. But I hated it all. Verse 18. Why did you hate it? Because also I just left a bigger inheritance for the person who followed me. He's questioning what's his legacy? What's he going to leave from all of his hard work? And we do all leave a legacy. We do. Author Max Lucado said simply but profoundly, outlive your life. Well, how do you do that? By leaving a legacy that has eternal significance. I'm sure we'll come back to that quote at some time in the study of Ecclesiastes. Outlive your life. Here's the conclusion. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. Again, God created us to work. There's honor in that. This too, I see, is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? Pause on that verse. Solomon's answer at this point in his reflection in life is that joy comes from God. For without him, apart from him, who can eat or find enjoyment? So we're very clear. Solomon, the scripture, is never down on enjoyment. First Timothy, we'll look at that verse just to sort of reflect on that for a moment. Command those who are rich in this present world, which by the way would be all of us. Every one of us has more than 95% of the rest of the world. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. God provides us everything for our enjoyment. Don't rush over that. That's God's desire for our lives, that there would be joy and enjoyment. He provides things for that end result. Because some Christians, if they were honest, their concept of God is this sort of cosmic killjoy who doesn't want us to experience pleasure. That would be worldly. Nothing could be further from the truth. God richly provides for our enjoyment. Or James chapter 1, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father. And when we begin to consciously recognize and then receive things as gifts from God, whether that be possessions or jobs or relationships, then we begin to find satisfaction in them. And we find more enjoyment in them. All those things point to something, or more correctly, they point to someone. Isn't God good? Nobody should enjoy this life more than those who know Jesus. He's the giver of all good and perfect gifts. And when we enjoy life, when there's a real sense of joy in our life, the non-believing world looks on and goes, that's interesting. Because when they're honest, they come to Solomon's conclusion. Life is meaningless and pointless and empty. But here's this person who says he follows Jesus, and there is joy in his life. The mistake is always that we fall in love with the gifts and not with the giver. And that really is the point of Ecclesiastes. Enjoyment is a good thing, but ultimately joy is not found in people or in things. It's found in the giver of the gifts, found in God. In his book, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis illustrates this. He writes this: "There lurks in most modern minds the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it is a bad thing. I submit that this notion has crept in from Kant and the Stoics," Kant, this atheist philosopher, "and the Stoics, and is no part of the Christian faith. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the gospel, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires for good not too strong, but too weak." God, according to C.S. Lewis, doesn't look at us and say, "I can't believe they're seeking pleasure." He looks at us and he says, "They're seeking pleasure in the wrong place. I want them to experience pleasure, but they're not going to find it if they're looking for it in hedonism or in accomplishing things for myself." Lewis continues, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are too easily pleased." When sin entered this world, we began to settle for temporary and fleeting pleasures that never really brought lasting pleasure. Search for eternal, soul-satisfying pleasure. Because the Bible's solution to emptiness of life, of a life of pleasure-seeking, is enjoying God, taking pleasure in God. Meaning is not found in self-gratifying pursuit of earthly pleasures, but true pleasure is found in God. And so Solomon is saying to the pleasure seeker in chapter 2, your problem is not that you want too much. It's that you are satisfied with too little. You're rejecting real, profound, lasting pleasure for that which is so temporal and transient. Life under the sun is so meaningless. And the deep longings of the human heart, that human heart with that God-shaped void in it that Augustine writes about, that is only satisfied in a relationship with our Creator. That's chapter 2. Wednesday night at 7, you want to join us? We kind of just work through the passage again. You bring questions. I'll bring a few questions. But you know what we really should? Wednesday night, if you come, I want everybody to bring their best joke. Okay? We're going to have a world's funniest joke contest to start. That could be fun. I am the worst joke teller in the world. Yeah. You know why? This is Valerie's joke. You know why a Norwegian can't tell jokes? Timing. See, I can't even tell that joke right. Let's pray. Father, we do acknowledge that longing in our heart. We acknowledge the pull of the world. We acknowledge trying to fill that God-shaped void with so many other things. We need your peace to just settle on us. That we would rest in the truth of we have a Creator who has pursued after us, who has given us eternal life, that we will spend eternity in your joyful presence. And that truth then translates into this life and gives us meaning and purpose and value and priorities. And so just confirm that in our heart right now as we continue on. Thank you for your word. Thank you for our Savior. Pray in Jesus' name. Well, you guys have an awesome, awesome week.